Thanks Sharon Waltman for being here to support our webinar and introduce our presenters. Sharon, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you now so you can introduce the topic and our presenters. You're on.
Okay, well thank you very much, Aaron. It's very nice to be with you all today. I just wanted to mention that we have with us today Dan Malarkey with the Soil Survey Resource Assessment Branch, and he'll be giving us a brief introduction. And then we have Lee Norfleet. Lee's our, maybe I'll let him introduce his title correctly, but I think he is our lead modeler for the SEEP program. Myself, I am a retired recovering bureaucrat, but I'm now a contractor with USDA, still doing soil geography. And we also have Peter Chen, Tony Osterling, and I don't know if Steve Teasley might be listening in too, and they will be available for some technical answers if we get to that level. So right now, I think I'd like to turn this over to Dan to begin a brief introduction. Our title, of course, is the Soil Vulnerability Index for Cultivated Cropland Redux, and we last spoke with you back in June of 2018, and we'd like to bring you up to date with what's been changing since that time. So take it away, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Sharon and Aaron. And thank you all for joining us today for the official rollout of the Soil Vulnerability Index for Cultivated Cropland. We're excited to make this SEEP-infused soil interpretation available to conservation planners and other NRCS users through the NGCE Geoportal. The SVI was developed by Kevin Ingram and Lee Norfleet. Kevin is the leader of RIAD's Resource Analytics Lab, and Lee is the SEEP model team leader, also in RIAD. Today, Lee will provide an overview of the genesis, methodology, and uses of the SVI, and then legendary and semi-retired soil geographer Sharon Waltman will cover last year's state-level peer review that led to updates in SVI 2.0, as well as discuss the user guide and how to access the web application. I'd like to thank Lee and Kevin, Peter Chen and Tony Osterling from the lab, Bob Dobos and Steve Peasley from the Soil Survey Center, and all the others who helped take this SVI from concept to the enterprise level data layer that's being rolled out today. And of course, special thanks to Sharon, who has devoted countless hours to developing a really top quality user guide. We're very appreciative of that. So with that, I will turn it over to Lee.
Okay, I think Sharon, you said I've got the ability to change the slide, so we're ready to go. So I'll go to the next slide to get into the start of the development of this index. We wanted it to be a pretty quick and fast tool for conservation planners, but it developed largely from us at the SEEP side in order to analyze the efficacy of conservation practices. We couldn't look at the thousands of different soil series, and we had to come up with some way to group them. And so this was an outgrowth of how to group these soils to look at how conservation practices impacted losses and productivity. And from that, the natural outgrowth would be, well, this would be very helpful for planners to rapidly determine what types of practices would be most effective on what types of soils. And again, it also speeds them up by using color combinations to show where the most likely places to look for issues and problems would be, and then they already have an idea of the solutions going to the field. So it's already had a pretty large role in a few projects around the country. Chesapeake Bay Watershed, some of the states in that used it to identify areas to focus at a regional scale. The National Water Quality Initiative has used it, MRBI, and you can see several of the other efforts around the country that have used it, including the state resource assessments. Here's a nice picture of where our cultivated cropland actually exists. It's the mask that's turned on. You can turn this mask on and off. as you will, and the planners can do that as well. And the planners will also have instructions because, just like land use can change the next day, if they turn the mask on and the mask doesn't cover what they know is cropland, they can, draw their new cropland field boundary in and utilize the SVI without the mask on. So, but this one is the one we preload that uses our crop data layer from NAS to give us an idea of where all the crops are and help the planners find their fields and their boundaries and look at those soils without interference from the surrounding non-cropland areas. So here's a snapshot from a regional scale. This is a HUC 4, Hydrologic Unit 4 for the Western Lake Erie Basin. Those of you familiar with the area or some of the geology of this area can readily identify where the ancient bed of Lake Erie had been, where the dark green is. That's where the low runoff is, very flat. You can see where some of the glacial features like terminal moraines and those type things have dropped out some heavier things and left some higher spots and some gravelly ridges and those type things. And that's where our runoff potential is the highest. And that's where you see in this kind of a ring, horseshoe-shaped ring around the low-lying area for the surface runoff. So, from the perspective of the regional planners or the folks looking at the GLRI, they should understand that, they're on the rims of this horseshoe. There ought to be a lot of practices related to runoff going in, and that's where they need to concentrate their efforts and maybe even looking at making sure they have enough money, because these runoff practices tend to be a little more expensive. So they would need to make sure they had allocations and plans in order to address those needs of those. Whereas in the lower lying areas, there's another suite of practices and efforts that would need to be taken into account. This is with the subsurface loss in the managed view or the drained view. We called it managed because it takes into account where tile drains are most likely to occur. We used a National Drainage Water initiative that the agency put together, and they came up with some criteria of which soils would tend to usually always need tile drainage in order to be productive. So we applied those rule sets. And so inherently some of these low flat soils are very heavy in this area, so they wouldn't have a lot of leaching potential until you put tile drains or surface ditches in them, and then they become quite highly leachable or highly susceptible and vulnerable to subsurface losses. So the tile drain losses are the biggest concern in this area. So it kind of, the opposite picture that we had before. You see the darker red in the center and the flatter lands, and then you have less vulnerability as you move out into that rim, although that rim still contains a good number of soils that need to have the tile drains addressed, changing the nutrient management, looking at drainage water management, and other forms of controlling nitrogen and phosphorus. And here's the natural look. So you can see the red spots there are probably very sandy, largely probably hydrologic group A type soils where some deep sands were deposited at one point or another. The rest, again, without the tile drains, would not be that susceptible to leaching. And we've worked our language around there. And then I always say leaching, but we've got to remember it's more than just that. It's any of the subsurface loss pathways. So it could be down into the groundwater, but it also could be down to some impermeable layer and then be return flows laterally. It's the tile flow, the ditch flow, and other natural processes of lateral movement of water in soil below the surface. So in using the SVI, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but by having these colors on the field, and we don't have a field up here that has multiple colors in it, but if you looked at multiple fields with a landowner or an individual field and you had the different reds and yellows and greens out there, you can focus your conversation with the client and improve their communications versus just trying to explain each of the different soil map units and unique soil series. Those are still important and still drive the process, and their unique properties will be addressed at the final stages of planning. But at this initial stage, working with them to speed them up, they can go look at the parts of the field that have the most likelihood of issues with either runoff or leaching, and more effectively discuss conservation solutions. So that's kind of the whole point behind this, is to allow them to speed their processes up, because they struggle to get out to the field, so they have to maximize the time that they spend out there. So in the development of this, I took all the factors, soil factors that we had with these, and compared them to the modeled losses that we had. We calibrate our models to known research, and then we apply these systems that we get through our farmer surveys to them. And so in doing that, we were able to determine which are the different properties and qualities of soils that we have that had the most impact on runoff and subsurface losses. And through that process, hydrologic group came out far and above the most indicative of that, which is probably no surprise to anyone about water moving through soil. The K factor became very important, not only because of its erodibility piece related to sediment losses, but if it's not erodible, it's usually fairly coarse, textured, or at least on the coarser side of the triangle, and that tends to have a higher infiltration rate, and that therefore would lead to a more likelihood of some subsurface loss. So it plays a dual role in that respect. And of course, slope is a very major component for this. We also looked at the soil taxonomy. Obviously, if you're building organic matter in a cumulic or histic epipedon, you're not having a lot of surface losses. So as soon as that hits in there, we know we've got low runoff potential and saturated conditions. So that's why we put them automatically there without going through what the hydrologic group and K factor and all that is. It just goes straight to those classifications. And then drainage class has some impacts on it as well. But the three main ones were that statistically came out were hydrologic group, K factor, and slope. And we ran several different statistical methods on this, and they always pop to the top. So in developing these thresholds to determine which one they are, and again, this is, if you remember the last time you may have looked at this, it's very similar to our old land capability classes. It's kind of a regional perspective. So even though you may have a high runoff rating in a more arid area, where the runoff may not occur that frequently, but when there is enough rainfall for significant runoff, these are the soils that are the first ones to start having some runoff issues. But what we did was we had a threshold that researchers had suggested as a minimum threshold, and so we ran the model with all the practices removed, so it was just their inherent condition. And those which had less than 2 tons of sediment loss, this isn't sheet and rill erosion, this is loss of sediment from the edge of the field. Those that exceeded 2 tons, we determined they were definitely low, because if you met the threshold without any conservation, we put you at low. We looked at some of the HEL, the more severe HEL lands, and saw that most all those were greater than 8 tons, so that gave us the top margin. And we looked at, thought that 4 classes were a good set, so we just split the difference between those to get the two in the middle. The next, for the subsurface loss thresholds, we did tried a couple of things. One, we tried to look at nitrate so we could bring in some of the exchange properties of soils and their ability to, the differences in adherence of the absorption of nitrates and phosphates. That didn't work that well with all the different fertilizer application rates in some crops in some regions. Use low nitrogen input crops, so it just didn't work as well. So we just went back straight to water loss and followed a very similar example. It literally just happened to turn out to be the same 2 and 8. It was not by design that 2 and 8 inches became the thresholds, but we did determine that less than 2 inches of subsurface loss was a low rate of loss, and this is in inches per year. Once you lost greater than 8 inches, that was a high amount of loss. And if you think about it, in an area that's 30 to 40 inch precip zone, that 8 inches of surface losses of runoff is a pretty good proportion of their overall rainfall that occurs. So that signified a significant amount of loss that was unacceptable. So that's why we gave it high, and then again split the middle. Sharon, is this where I hand this over to you?
I believe it is.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll take it from here, and we just wanted to bring you up to date with the release of this, the SVI for Cultivated Cropland 2.0 data and documentation. According to my sources, I understand that a National Bulletin number 290-19-8 is going to be released today, the September 17th, and it's going to give you some details about this. And attached to it, it's called Attachment A, is actually the full 2.0 user's guide. So that will be where your source will be for all of your basic documentation about these changes that are different between the first release and 1.0 and the changes we've made since that time based on the peer review results. And then also it will give you some instruction in Appendix A of the user guide about how to access and use the web application 2.0. And we'll make a mention that I think there is also an Appendix B that contains a short tutorial on how to use the web application, and that that document was prepared before we migrated from Geoportal 10.5.1 to 10.6.1, I guess that's right. And so the visuals are a little different, and we're going to be working on upgrading those, and we'll release Appendix B again once we get that upgraded. So just be a heads up on that. And also make mention that this is intended for NRCS staff use only and for official use only. Just as many of our more sensitive things are, we wish to keep them in the hands of our qualified staff. All right, so where did we leave off? Well, just we'll talk to you a little bit about where we last talked about the Soil Vulnerability Index for Cultivated Cropland back in June of 2018 when we asked you to conduct a peer review. And we provided you with a first user's guide, web application with data, and asked you to answer about 35 questions on SurveyMonkey. And those questions were related to the cultivated cropland layer, runoff, the leaching managed, and even the web application itself. Those responses were gathered between August and I guess it was October. We wrapped it up and we summarized them. And you'll find a full summary of those results in the Appendix C of the User's Guide 2.0. The first part one of that is the multiple choice survey question results summarized, and then there's a part two where we have attempted to summarize all the open-ended narrative questions where you were allowed to simply write a short sentence or two about an answer to the question posed or if there were any other questions or concerns. So those are included as well. I also mentioned that several of you did extra work and provided narrative summaries of your evaluation of the tool, and we're very grateful for your work to put that together. So let's take a little. And again, we'll only talk about the high points today on these, but I would encourage you to go and read Appendix C to see the answers to each question. We've got about a full response from all of our lower 48 states. Some states provided more than one review or pooled their reviews to provide a summary, a composite review. We had a total of number of 56 surveys completed, and And I think we had about 42 names submitted, and the total number of reviewers was about 85. Of those, about 71 were actually working in the Geoportal and using the web application. Let's take a look at some of these. This one is just an example question related to the cultivated cropland layer. Pardon me. And it's sort of a negative question, but we're asking what land uses were not very well represented in the cropland data layer. Pardon me again. And here is about 45% of the respondents said that it looked like pasture and any other thing beyond CRP, hayland, and field crops weren't doing very well, and mostly because we were looking at a very large field scale. And as a result, we realized, and also many comments, that they really did not wish to have the soil data layer mapped using the cultivated cropland when working at the field scale, because the land use pattern is a seasonal change to it, and so there's really no way to keep up. And they did not want to have any bounds put on their use of the soil data layer when assessing those cropping patterns. Here's kind of a typical question from related to the cultivated cropland runoff risk for vulnerability. How well does the SVI-cc runoff classification rank the cultivated soils for vulnerability to runoff of sediment and nutrients into your surface waters? And most of the time, we were getting things that were pretty much about 42% going into the okay, and maybe about 37% into the good range. But we did have about 10% in the not so good, and maybe 2% that just flat out bad, and very good, maybe about 7%. A lot of times we were having a basic question between the irrigated portion of cropland and non-irrigated portion of cropland too. That was an important concern of how to use the index in those settings. Here's the one typical question for leaching managed. How well does this one rank the soils for vulnerability to the loss of nutrients due to leaching? And again, we're about in the okay and good category, 46% okay, 33% good, about 12% not so good, and 5% were coming up bad, and about 2% in the good category. Pretty typical spread there. And here is the leaching inherent where no management has been applied, and asking again, how well does it rank those cultivated soils in your area? And again, we have near over half now say that's okay. Good was about 32, and not so good still hovering around 13% with about 2% on the bad and the very good realm there as well. We also asked several questions about a karst landscape, and the question was basically, should the presence or absence of carbonate karst within a 12-digit HUC or watershed be considered in adjusting these SVI data sets? We asked the same question for each one of them, the rule sets, when landscapes that have carbonate karst are involved. And overwhelmingly, about 75%, probably most of those who had to deal with those kinds of landscapes said yes. Now, we have not adjusted our rule sets in 2.0 to account for this, but we have raised the awareness of the users very keenly, I think, about this kind of an issue. And some of the folks, just for a quick responding here about karst, some I've corresponded with have actually been doing a great deal of research and bringing very high resolution local state geological survey sources into their planning consideration, where they're actually mapping out sinkholes and other kinds of karst features that kind of short circuit runoffs and leaching type subsurface and surface leaching losses directly into aquifers and surface waters. So that was a good thing, I think, to raise that awareness. I think Lee has some thoughts on how we expect those adjustments could be made in a reasonable fashion too. And lastly, we ask a few questions about the web application. This is our first effort on that. And the majority, just nearly 80%, did find the web application useful. There was a factor of about a little over 20% that said no. And I know that it was quite different to have this kind of a web application through Geoportal be presented for institutional use like that. So it's quite different than some of the other conventional tools that were out there, maybe like Web Soil Survey or the Conservation Planning Toolkit and that sort of thing. It's quite different. So we anticipated that. But not too, mostly they were good. There were some really great answers and very direct critique, too, of them, too. We've tried to improve it, but there's still more to be done. I'd just like to review quickly some of the changes, the summary of the changes, and those you can find them in detail in the user guide related to definition, the data, terminology, rule sets, and then just a brief example, a few sample calculations. In the user's guide, in the definition section, you open up that PDF, you'll find a nice set of bookmarks that are hierarchical. You can open those up and get to the data pretty quick. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. And the soil vulnerability definition itself is just about the same. I think we inserted the word pathogen for biological hazard, that kind of thing was in there. And then the SVI rating itself, we kind of rewrote it as a crisp classification soil interpretation, meaning that it had 4 distinct classes. It's categorical rather compared to the fuzzy gradient type classifications we often do in soil survey these days, and that it is restricted, it's intended to be restricted to those cultivated cropland portions of the landscape when we're used in regional national assessments. But when we do get down to the field scale, it's like we do the classification of the SVI wall-to-wall across the nation, but it's intended to be used in the agricultural portion of the landscape. The data sources used, those are detailed in the book too. We switched over and used the fiscal year 2018 SERGO and GSERGO data sources. These are the sources that were fully available to us when our toolkit was ready. And I think the goal is to always use whatever the institutional official copies will be once the enterprise infrastructure allows that within the agency. We also updated the cultivated cropland maps with the most current data sources, which happen to be 2017 sources from NASS and FSA, and I think we were still using a 2011 NLCD, or the National Land Cover Database from USGS. The toolbox that is used to actually compute and class the soil components has a November 5th, 2018 addition to it, and that's what we're using today in the web application. Some changes in terminology. You probably saw we kind of switched back and forth between leaching and subsurface losses and so forth. So we have a little summary in here about how those changes were arrived at and what the translations of terms are. You'll find that both in the introduction, in the preparation section, and also in the geoprocessing steps. So in this little graphic, from old on the left-hand column to new on the right, the runoff becomes surface loss. It's a more general term, and as Lee mentioned, it kind of covers more of all the possible functions that are taking place in the landscape. Leaching managed became subsurface loss drained or managed. And then leaching, or inherent leaching, became subsurface loss undrained or unmanaged. And the little asterisk is there because we don't really see this used too often, except in some special cases, because most often if we're dealing with relatively level and off-drained portions of the landscape in cultivation, it's very likely that they will be drained in the right kinds of climates. All right, so some of the rule set changes. Surface loss. We did make some adjustments from the 1.0. We found some oversight issues we corrected. And then also we simplified the rule set too. We went from using the fragment-free erodibility factor, the KF fact _R, and an estimate of the rock fragment volume at the surface, to simply using the whole soil erodibility factor, the KWF fact _R, and drop the rock volume, rock fragment volume. We also added taxonomic terms, tachyc and cumulic, to the histosol and histic epipet rule. Here's the updated rule set. You can study that in more detail. But you can see here, rather than just histosol or histic, now we also include cumulic and tachyc classifications. If the answer to the presence of any of those is yes, they automatically skip everything else and go strictly to a low setting for the surface loss. All right, now for subsurface loss drained. Some important changes were, again, we changed from the fragment-free K factor to the whole soil fragment factor, soil erodibility factor, and dropped the rock fragment. We also added the tachyc and cumulic, and we basically adopted the leaching managed rule set to represent the subsurface loss drained. This table is, if we're still on the CC subsurface loss and drain conditions, this last column on the right-hand side really deals with just those components where we have less than 3% slope and very poor, somewhat poorly drained classes. And so those get bumped up in vulnerability a class or two. So we deal just with those for the drained condition there. And then when we go to the undrained condition, it's very similar, except we don't have to deal with the drained option on that. So undrained assumes it's the same table. It's minus that sixth column on the right. We assume that the relatively level and wet soils are not drained. So that was how that one works. Some sample calculations. You can go there, that section. I pulled out one of the more interesting map units that has a multiple components here. This table is organized. This looks a little different than in the first user guide. Tony generated a tool that helps spit these out very quickly, but so we kept this one. It's really quite good. In the left-hand column, it says attribute. This is the column heading for each attribute. That is an input for the model. And the last three rows in the table are the ratings. So they go surface loss, subsurface loss drained, subsurface loss undrained. So for component 1, which happens to be Hagerstown, you can see that it has a moderate and moderately high and moderate ratings. Component 2, however, is Carbo, and it has high and 2 lows. And component 3, Opequon, is very similar. Component 4 is Bunkstown. It's got a low and 2 moderates, and Timberville is moderately high and 2 moderates. So we actually do the classification of these SVI-cc rule sets at the component level, and then we roll them up to come to a dominant condition or a majority condition. And we give a companion table for each one of those. I think there may be as many as 12 examples in the user's guide. We tried to pick some soil map units that were representative of cultivated landscapes across the nation. So here you can see that map unit. On the map, it may appear orange and have a moderately high rating for surface loss. However, there could be as much as 10% that has high, 3% low rating in that map unit somewhere. So it alerts the user, the planner, to know that they ought to be looking around for other issues in that field when they encounter that map unit. So for subsurface loss, drained and undrained, they're very similar. We can account for 90% of that as moderate will be color green on the map. But there could be 10% of the map unit that's low in that case, in both of those ratings cases. here in surface loss, 87% is carrying the color that you'll see on the map. And we look at that a little more closely on the user guide, within the user's guide, and on the web application using the pie charts. So now, hopefully, we'll try a live demo and go into this very quickly. In Appendix A of your user's guide, you will get a URL that will take you to this website, and it's just a click on this actual image will enter you into the Geoportal. But I would like to point out that at the bottom here where the red arrow is, you can download the user guide from this point too if you don't have it as an attachment A on the National Bulletin. And, you'll see this little repeat of announcing where you are, the fiscal year 2018 SVI-cc 2.0 web application. And you can check this box if you don't want to see that again, or just say okay. One of the new pieces that we've added, this is the work of Peter Chen, and I guess Tony Osterling worked very diligently to prepare the data sets here for this too, as well as Steve Peasley, who helped generate the SVI scripts and maintain them and adjust them as we proofed them through time. So here's the work that we're about to show you. Peter added just a little SVI reference legend to help quickly show you the reference legend if you need it. So this is a new widget that's added, pardon me, over what you'll see in the documentation. Usually in the documentation we ask you simply to open the layer box here and resize it so you can see all 10 of the operational layers. We included the major land resource areas of the United States. We have a common land unit, common land units. It's a 2013 data set. Pardon me, I just need to get a drink. Okay. Now for reference, I think there's a much better data set that's out there actually used in planning. We have watershed boundary data set. I'll turn this one back on too. And this one I like because it's hierarchical. Maybe you guys are using it already. As you move down through, we'll zoom down at the different layers. You're going to get different layers. Right now we're at the HUC 4. We started out at HUC 2, and we'll go to HUC 8. And then down on the ground, we'll get down to HUC 12. We get down in there. Yeah. And so we'll close that. And then we've still included the carbonate heat map. For those who are familiar with using these online applications, web applications, you probably are familiar with these, but those who are not, you simply go to the right-hand side. You can adjust the transparency depending on where you're working. You may need a little darker or lighter and so forth. The carbonate heat map, again, was just a little screening tool to help you know if you're in a watershed that may have potential for karst topography in there or not. Let's see if we zoom in one more time. The nomenclature here, you get like a percentage of the land area that perhaps has limestone bedrock. It might be an indicator of that, and that's what that means. And then I think we'll zoom back out, go home, and turn off the carbonate karst. And then we have the three soil vulnerability layers. We have surface loss, and this is the math version, which is appropriate for regional and national book, surface loss. We have subsurface loss drained, also mapped for the lower 48, using the Cropland 2017 Cropland mask prepared by the RIAD group there in Beltsville. And as Lee had mentioned and showed you earlier, and then the subsurface loss undrained. Now each of these also has a no mask version, so these will appear when we get close down onto the ground at field level. So I would like to take you through just a little sample from the middle of the nation here, and we're going to look at surface loss, and I'm going to click on both of those at the same time. If you wish, I think we'll try this. I'm going to take you to Richardson County in Nebraska. So you can search there for an address, or you can search for zip codes, a variety of addresses and so forth to find your place. And then I have stored some bookmarks. Across the bottom here, you'll have the operational map layer list. From this widget, you could change the base map gallery if you wish to. We won't do that now, but it's there if you wish. And then I'd like to introduce the bookmarks. These are going to be very important. Pardon me. Very important. So if you have a study area you're working on you would like to visit, you'll want to bookmark it so you can get there rapidly. So we're going to go to a place in MLRA 106 that's not too far from Football City. I think where we're at here. And I'm not sure, pardon me, which layer you're looking at. Just turn on this little guy and it will tell you we're looking at surface loss and brings up a simple legend. Since all three layers use the same legend, sometimes you can get a little bit confused. Which legend are we looking at? All right, so we have, you can see here in yellow, is that 2013 version of the CLU. And we're just going to examine a little point right here in this parcel. And just for basic query, we give you the county, and we give you the MLRA. It happens to be 106, Nebraska and Kansas, Lusk, Drift Hills, as well as the CLU. You can see the CLU itself is actually highlighted. The others were also highlighted, but they're way zoomed out, so you can't see the perimeter for the MLRA and so forth, or the county. And we just have some basic attributes in here. Again, this is an older snapshot. I don't know how current this is, but you get everything from CLU number, tract number, farm number, CLU classification, calculated acreage, HEL land type code, and a variety of other information, state and county codes, and the dates of creation and last date change, so you can evaluate. All right, so if you want to work on this parcel, maybe you want to know what's going on for surface loss in this part of the parcel. So let's go. I recommend starting with the pie chart widget, which you'll find in the upper right-hand corner. And once you activate it, you can then take the cursor and place it on the spot where you're interested in. And the first thing that happens is that it's going to show you the full extent of the map unit you've just selected, which in this case is pretty extensive. And while we've got that open here, we need to do two more things. This pie chart will give you 3 pies, one for each of the rule sets, and we just need to open those, keep them open. And then we can go back to our bookmark and return to where we were. That zoom feature is not one of my favorites in this web application, and it is a function of the way that the data were prepared. And we are re-examining that for any of the SVI-cc 3.0 applications that may be developed and improve that. Ultimately, I think it would be great to have this as a interpretation that is published with the standard field survey geographic data, the Surgo or GSurgo data set, and make it a lot more easily gotten to. All right, so you can see that there's a blue highlight has appeared. That means that is your selected map unit, and that the pie tool will tell you what's going on here. What we're finding is that when we look at that, of all of the components that we're making up that map unit, we only are giving a map unit key right here, right now. 89% have a high rating, that's shown down here. 8% have a low rating. Let's turn back on the legend too. Keep it straight. And then 3% have a moderately high rating. We can look at that for subsurface loss drained. And scroll to this. And you can see that was 89% here and here. So it's about the same breakdown, but it's almost the inverse for that. And we go to the undrained and just scroll down, you'll see the same. It's nearly the same classification in this case for this map unit. So you're probably wondering and asking yourself, well, why? What's going on? Why is going on with that thing? Let's see, do I have the right one here? Yeah. So what we have, let's see, we'll go back to surface loss here. We can go to the component query, and if we click here, it will turn back to us and show us the names of the soils. So in this case, we're dealing with an exarban. Let's just query this now. Once the component or the combo widget is activated, the highlight will turn pink. So now we've got one more thing to query here, and that is the name. It's the exarban silty clay loam, 6 to 11% slopes eroded. So with this tool, we can actually look at and examine each one of those components with their inputs and the resulting classifications, which are given at the list at the bottom of the list here. For example, the second component is Judson. It's the mollisol. It has 8% slope. 8% composition, 4% slope. It's a cumulocapulodol. It's got a B hydrologic group. Its KW factor is 0.32. It's a well-drained soil. So these gives you all of the inputs and the resulting outputs that are available there if you need to examine what's going on there. So with those, I think this is about the end of our demonstration of what we can do. I guess I can ask if there's any particular questions or activities you want us to look at here. Otherwise, I think we're nearly at the end of our time zone, or timeline here. So with that, send it back to my other presenters to see if they have more they'd like to do. I do have one more slide that has contact information on it too. So.
Comments, we had a question. Is this the same routine that was used, that will be used for sheet and rill erosion for cart? I believe that was answered. I'm not sure if it's used in cart for sheet and rill, but it is in the water quality portion and sediment. The rainfall information using R factors are very outdated, and outlier erosive storms were removed to smooth the R factor curves. There's a question, is there any flexibility to alter hydrologic soil group due to soil characteristics for the area? And that one we do not have an answer for. So if one of the presenters could approach that question. Is there any flexibility to alter the hydrologic soil group due to soil characteristics for the area?
This is Lee. From my perspective, I think that is perfectly fine. Now, how you do that in your GIS context for your state, I think you'd have to work through Sharon or Peter or someone to make that change, that local change for you. So even if it's in a sub-state part, if we can geospatially locate where you want to make that change, I don't see why there shouldn't be any reason we could do that, to give you local control over the soils you know best.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
By the way, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, perfect.
We can see your question and answers and your SVI-cc contacts. And if the window is too small, you can press on the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner to make it larger. Okay, do we have any other questions for today? And type them into the chat window if you do.
this is Sharon. I understand that national bulletin is due to be released sometime today, later today. So that should become available, and then the user guide and so forth will be, the link to get to that web page will be in Appendix A in there.
Okay. We have a question in the chat. It says many of the comments were use properties, not interpretations. What was the reasoning for not changing?
I'll defer to Lee on that one.
Yeah, in many cases, a lot of the properties weren't populated, whereas the interpretations were. If you go into the system, you'll find that, especially when we started creating this. And a lot of also the properties, you'll also note some things like hydrologic conductivity. If you do a distribution graph, you'll see things, or you get a lot of the same answers for a lot of the same soils. So they've been measured, but then they've been put in classifications, so they're almost like interps themselves. But the overriding thing is that in using the interps, like hydrologic group is an interp, it just worked better for the result that we were getting through the modeling system, and it's more communicable to our field office folks than some of the soil properties are, since we are not dealing with soil scientists in many cases, and to be quite honest, a lot of the training and understanding of soils by the planners are not what they had been in the past. So using more of the things that they are more familiar with was a driving force behind using those. Not only that, but the statistical use of those interps and their relationships to the estimated losses drove the reasoning behind those. Properties were tried, but then you start getting things continuous. Multiple lines of continuous variables often don't work as well as putting things in categories to come up with an interpretation, and that's just the way natural systems are. They don't always work in clean, continuous fashions, so a lot of times you have to go to classification type boxes or interps, if you will, to make the system work.
All right, we've got one last question. Would adding the elevation web service for LiDAR-derived slope gradient be considered for the Geoportal web app?
Oh, this is a good one. Well, there were a couple things. Kind of following on to using the properties and not interpretations, I think I'll just add one extra comment to that one, too. In our estimated properties databases and the soil survey, in the past, they weren't as very good. Let me think about that now. They were not as closely linked to properties, the interpretations, but in more recent times, there were a very much stronger coupling between them. So some of the, like the hydrologic soil group and other things like that, are actually derived from the properties now. So that made a difference there. And we did have many questions about getting smaller or larger scale or finer resolution information to feed into the interpretation. And I think that's the really exciting part about where this could go, is you could get to produce a classification or a vulnerability ranking almost at a cellular level if you needed to do that, and then count up all the cells and do your rankings for whatever land area it is that you need to. So something like the LiDAR-derived slope gradient would be a deal changer, I think.
I think the big question behind that is, at what point will we have the speed to do that? I'm afraid that would slow the, again, the goal was to make things faster. So if you're trying to load that up in the field with a landowner, are you going to be able to do it at that level? And now a predetermined map that's already there that you could download and have with you, that would work real well. But I think I think that's the way we need to look at it, because then at that scale we might be able to start locating places where ephemeral gullies could be created, and that would even further allow the conservationists and the landowners to start looking for conservation solutions in those areas. So I think it's something to keep in mind and strive for, but I think we also have to remember there's going to be some possible speed limitations to use live, and if we can do it where they can take that map with them without relying on having it built on the fly, so to speak, and then that would be what we'd want to go for first.
Yeah, I think pre-processing would be needed there, but yes, good stuff.
Okay. We're after 2 o'clock. If you have additional questions, there's contact information on the screen. I'd like to thank all of the presenters for their time and effort to make the presentation, and to thank all the participants for joining in. We hope you found the information beneficial. We had more than 55 people join today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our NSSC YouTube within a couple of days. So please feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. If the presenters have any last words, now would be a good time.
I guess the only thing to remember is that this is for field folks. You know, it would be a totally different way. We wouldn't even need a tool if it were for soil scientists, because you know all this. So it's when you make your local adjustments, do it. You know, please work with the field planners and help them do their job quicker. That's the sole goal of this. So any of your local adjustments you might want to do, work with them to see what makes their lives easier and quicker to get through contracting, because that's kind of the whole point behind taking all of our intricate work of having all these series and all the properties and interps that we have all these soils. We know those, but when it moves towards the conservation planner, and then again that planner working with a landowner to communicate that, they need to have the best and simplest way to move that forward to get the right conservation on the ground.
All right, that concludes our webinar presentation for the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.